Before we start this video, a large thank you to Austin, Dark Crusader, Chris, and Liam for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. And an immense thank you to Halo Burner for their continued support to the channel this month on Patreon. It is greatly appreciated, my friend, and as always, I hope you enjoy the video. Hello guys, apologies for any noise in the background. I'm still not in my office, so you may hear my dogs walking around. So today we're going to do the stance break system, and the stance break system is going to go a little something like this. I'm going to use an example here and keep it very simple. So let's say you hit an enemy a couple of times and they go down to about 50% stance. If you keep hitting them again a couple more times without giving them a long break in between, this will bring them to 0% stance. And at this point, they will play a stance break animation. Now, during this stance break animation, you're free to hit them or perform a critical attack. It looks something like this. This is an example in our Project Nephilim. So I'm going to bait out the swing here, do a fully charged heavy attack. There's a stance break, and then I can perform a critical repost. That's it. Okay, so let's get started. Also, at the end of the video, there is a semi-important announcement regarding the series I would like your input on, so if you want to leave a comment to my question later on, that will be great. Alright, so let's go to the AI Character Combat Manager. Let's add a new header for stance. I'm going to call it stance/posture. Actually, I'm just going to call it stance. Whatever you want to call it, I believe Elden Ring calls it stance, so I'm going to call it that. Now, under here, I'm going to make a few variables. The first one is a public float for our maximum stance. The next is going to be a public float for our current stance. So obviously, the maximum is whatever stance a character can have, and the current is whatever's been taken away in addition to what they would have normally. So we're going to have a serializable field for ignore stance breakdown if you want to see it in the inspector. You're going to want to see it in the inspector if you want to toggle this. This just makes it so you can make some characters ignore the ability to be stance broken in case you want to do that. It's really useful for things like cutscenes and stuff too, or certain transitions where you don't want to break the state. And we're also going to have a serializable float for stance regenerated per second. So this is going to be a stance you regain when your stance starts going back up. Okay, cool. So next let's make a header for stance timer. And I'm going to change this one to stance settings. So remember, there's a timer too, and if you keep attacking a character, their stance won't go back up because it will reset this timer. So let's make a serializable field for a float. Time until stance regenerates is equal to 0. And I'm going to make another float here for the default time. Actually, I'm going to change this one just to stance regeneration timer, because this is just the timer, and if it's on 0, then your stance will regenerate. If it's above 0, it will not. So the default time until your stance regenerates is going to be, say, just say 15 for the sake of this. And again, this is going to be the number that the timer gets reset to every time a character is hit. Alright, so right below awake, I'm just going to make a private void for handle stance break. And as the name suggests, this is going to be where we just kind of use the timer and adjust our stance. So we're going to say if AI character is not owner return, you only want to run this on the fixed update of the actual owner of the character, because we're going to process it from one side only and play the animation from one side only, which will send a server RPC. If you're dead, return. We don't want to play a stance break animation if the character is already dead. And we're going to say if stance regeneration timer is greater than 0, stance regeneration timer minus equals time.delta time. So it's just going to count down every second if it is greater than 0. Now, if it is equal to 0 or less, we're going to say it's equal to 0, and then we can start adding on some stance that we've lost. Okay, so right below that, we're going to say if current stance is less than max stance, we want to add up some stance over time. Now, we want to give this its own timer too, because we only want to do it once every second. We don't want to do it every single frame, otherwise you'd shoot back to full instantly. So we're going to say begin adding stance each tick. So let's make a tick timer. You don't need to make this serializable unless you want to see it for some reason, so you can do that if you'd like, or you can just make it private. It's going to be a float, and just call it whatever makes the most sense to you. Since this is a tick timer for stance, I'm just going to call this public float stance tick timer. Now, if you have some kind of universal tick timer you want to use for everything, you can just go ahead and use that instead. But I'm going to give it its own and just put it right here. So I'm going to say stance tick timer plus equals time.delta time. If the stance tick timer is greater than or equal to 1, I'm going to reset it at 0 by saying stance tick timer is equal to 0. And then I'm going to say current stance plus equals. Then we're going to have the stance regained or regenerated per second. All right, now I'm going to save that. And right below this if statement, we're going to say, as in if current stance is less than max stance, else it's going to be current stance is equal to max stance. So if for some reason it's above, then we're going to set it to max. All right. Right below that, again, we're going to do a couple more checks before we actually play the stance break animation. We're going to say if current stance is less than or equal to 0. This right now is where we would play it, but we're going to make a few checks first. To do, you can say, optionally, if we're in the middle of some crazy damage animation, like you getting launched in the air, we don't want to play it then, or maybe you do, but I find it kind of feels very bad in game if you're, say, charging an ultra great sword and you're expecting to send an enemy flying, but instead they stay stationary and play the stance break animation. So what I do is I ignore it and set their stance to 1. So when they get back up again, all you have to do is tap them and it breaks their stance. I find this feels a lot better. This is completely just, I guess you could say optional low, and it comes down to preference. So to me, this feels less impactful. And you know what? I'm actually going to do this right now because we're going to need to use this system anyway for storing our previous damage intensity more in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and make that right this second because it's very fast. So what you want to do is go to your character combat manager and you want to make a variable to store the previous intensity of damage you took via poise damage. So I'm going to make a header called previous poise damage taken. And it's quite simple. You just keep a float here. And every time you have a damage effect pass through your character, you just store the poise damage that was taken on that damage effect here. So go over to, we have 1 right now, we said take damage effect. Right where you calculate your poise damage here and subtract it, right below that, you can just say character.character combat manager dot previous poise damage taken is equal to the poise damage. So this will be used again in the future for other things. Whoops, it's supposed to be equals, not minus. Okay, so right below that, I'm just making a comment. We store the previous poise damage taken for other interactions. And that's it for now. We can jump back over to our character combat manager, or sorry, our AI character combat manager. And now right here, we're just going to do a simple check. In my case, I don't want to play a stance break if we're doing a colossal damage animation. This is typically something that will launch you into the air or throw you. So I'm going to make a check by making a damage intensity variable. I'm going to say previous damage intensity is equal to world utility manager .instance.get damage intensity, and we're going to pass our previous poise damage. So if this is equal to colossal damage, we're going to simply set our current stance to 1 and return. So I will say if previous damage intensity is equal to damage intensity.colossal, and again, this is 100% optional. If you don't want to do this, you'd rather skip the stance break, just leave this part out. I personally like it a lot more because this allows you to get a stance break immediately again. Anyway, when they get up, just hit them again for 1 more. So it kind of adds on to it. You get your big damage animation where you throw somebody, and then you hit them 1 more time and you pop the stance break. So to do, if we are being backstabbed or reposted, so critically damaged, we don't want to actually play a stance break. Otherwise, we'll break us out of that state. So we can do the same thing that we do for the colossal animation. Just set the stance to 1 and return. And that's it. So now you'll basically not interrupt the animation that's playing to actually damage somebody via backstab or riposte. So we don't have a backstab or riposte in, but we will come back to that when we add it. Riposte is coming up very soon because we need it for this part of the series. Next, we're going to say current stance is equal to max stance. If you pass those checks, we're going to do 1 more. If ignore stance break for whatever reason, if this monster or creature cannot be stance broken, then just simply return. Then we're going to say AI Character Animator Manager, or Character Animator Manager rather. We're going to say play target action animation stance break 01. So remember, this only runs if you're the owner, so it's okay to call this here without checking for owner. And that's basically it. Now we just need a way to actually damage the stance as well. Now, you can use one of these damage animations that you have if you're using any of my sets. If not, you can just grab whatever animation you want. So for now, I'm going to use the actual stance broken animation. If you have any of our animation packs, this will be added to the next update for free. But until then, you can just use one of the hit animations if you have them. So again, it's not there yet, but it will be added for free across every weapon animation set that we have. So I am going to create an animation state in the animator called stance break 01. And then I'm just going to transition here like so. And there's a couple things you want to happen here. We can't play a sound effect here because remember, this is only being ran if we are the owner. So we want to use an animation event for that so it's played everywhere. So I am going to also make a fixed update here. I'm going to run this on fixed update just because it runs a little less often than an update. And I'm going to place handle stance break in there. So next, let's go to the character sound effect manager and let's make a general virtual void for play stance broken sound effect. And you can override this if you want and play a different sound effect for certain characters, but generally it's probably going to be the same for every character unless you have some cool unique idea for it. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab a sound effect from the world sound effect manager that doesn't exist yet. So I'm just going to, whoop, not that one. Going to copy from play roll sound effect here and just replace the roll sound effect with the stance break sound effect that doesn't exist yet. So stance break sound effect, just like that. All right, I'm going to save that. Now I'm going to go over to my world sound effect manager. I'm going to open that up and I'm going to make a variable for it. So under action sounds, public audio clip, stance break sound effect. And again, you can use whatever sound effect you want. There are literally thousands of free sound effects on Unity Asset Store. You can also find them online. I'm just going to grab one that I have for Nephilim here and drop that in there. That'll be the same one you heard earlier in the video, most likely. I am going to go to my FBX now and add an animation event. So for the playing the sound effect. So I want to do this as soon as the animation plays, because that is the idea. And we're just going to call that play stance break sound effect. Good to go. And now we need a way to actually subtract stance from our character. So let's make a public void damage stance. What we're going to say first is we're going to reset the actual stance timer. So the stance regeneration timer is equal to the default time until stance regeneration begins. So every single time you get hit, this timer is reset. So the idea is if you keep hitting an enemy before this timer hits 0, you'll reset the timer and continue to chip away at their stance. So basically this rewards a more aggressive combat style, and you can adjust this timer for enemies. Maybe some enemies will recover their stance quicker than others. Maybe some don't recover it at all. So I'm just going to make a comment here. When stance is damaged, the timers are set, meaning constant attacks give no chance at recovering stance that is lost. Next, we're going to simply say current stance minus equals stance damage. That doesn't exist. So let's make this require an integer for stance damage. And that is it. Now the last thing to do is to call this function wherever we're damaging a character. So what we want to do is call that on our take damage. So let's copy this. And let's go over to our take damage effect. And now there are two ways to do this, but you want to give it its own function for sure. Private void, we're going to call this calculate stance damage. You can give each weapon and spell and whatever their own individual stance damage rating, like you do with poise. You might want to do this for some reason, but I'm going to just do what I do in Nephilim, and I'm going to give the stance damage the same rating as the poise damage. So I am going to make this require a character manager variable. I'm going to call it character, and then I'm going to have an AI character variable in there, and I'm going to cast that from the character as an AI character manager. Next, I'm going to have a local variable for float stance damage. I'm going to equate this to the poise damage that was done on this take damage effect. So I can say, again, you can optionally give weapons their own stance damage, but I'm going to make mine poise damage. So because of that, where I place this in the chain, where it's called, is going to be more important than if it had its own individual variable. So more on that in a second. I'm going to say if the AI character does not equal null, I just want to simply damage their stance by referencing their AI character combat manager and then passing damage stance. And then in that function, we'll pass our stance damage. Okay, so cool, that's done. Now, where do we call it? Oh, we got to make this into an int and then round this by saying mathf.roundInt. All right, so where do we call that, and why is it more important than not? So we need to call this after the total poise damage has been calculated, and we also need to call this after any other animation were to play, otherwise it will get interrupted, or it potentially could. So you can see here we have calculate damage. This is where poise damage is calculated. So you want it after this, but you also want it to play after play directional based damage animation. And just to be safe too, I'll play it after all the VFX and sound effects, but I know it's fine as long as it's after those two. So the reason being, if a stance break happens to happen, you want this to prioritize the stance break animation and not a damage animation. Because remember, we already do checks in here if we're meant to ignore it, so this should come last in the sequence. So run this after all their functions that would attempt to play any other animation upon being damaged, and also after your poise damage has been calculated if you're going to use poise damage as a way to chip away at someone's stance. If you have your own variable for that, then it's not so important there, as long as you pass this after that variable has been calculated wherever it may be. All right, cool. Let's save that, and let's go over now into the project again, and let's look for the character network manager. And now, we're going to add a flag here. This is a very important flag, and we'll use this in the next video. This flag is going to be called isRepostable, and this is going to be used in two instances: if a character is stance broken or if a character has been parried. So a repost is a critical strike in the Souls series / ELDEN game, where you kind of jab somebody after they've been parried or stance broken, or stab them rather, for usually higher damage than normal. So I'm going to go to the character combat manager, and I'm going to make a public void for enable isRepostable. We're going to check for owner since this is a network variable, and this is going to be called on an animation event. We're going to say if character.isOwner, then we're going to set isRepostable to true. So this is where you would call this function on specific points in an animation where you want a character to be able to receive a repost. And we're going to do that right now too and set it up where we want it. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to copy that, go to our FBX file. And generally you want it just a little bit after, not instantly. Otherwise you can kind of instantly get out of the animation and go to the critical damage animation, which looks a little bit silly. So let's go a few frames in here, and then right there looks fine. And again, this animation will be available for free on all the packs eventually. It's just not out right now. I will probably make an announcement when it is. So let's go to reset action flag. And again, if you're the owner, reset if you can be reposted. It'd be kind of awkward if it was just there forever and you went back to your normal state and got reposted out of nowhere. So let's switch that to false. Save that. Now, if I go into the project here, you can see the default time. I'm going to change this to 3 so you can see it. So default stance regeneration time. Now, if I swing at this character, boom, you can see I've lowered their stance. That's working. The timer goes down to 0. Then after the timer goes down to 0, the stance starts going back up. Cool. Working as intended. So now what happens if I set the stance to, say, 10, very low, and if I hit them again, they should play the stance break animation. So boom, and they didn't because I didn't put the animation in their animator. So that's the undead animator. I only put it in the humanoid one. It's my mistake. So I will quickly go to the undead animator over here, go to the animation window, and I'll paste it in there. So now if I set their stance to a low number and hit them, then they should play it, and boom. Yes, they do. But it looks kind of bad. Do you see that? That's because it's blending, and we don't want that. It's trying to blend the stance break animation from the locomotion animation like that. And because it's supposed to be so sudden, it looks very bad. How do we fix this? Well, let's change this from play action animation to play action animation instantly. So this doesn't exist yet. Let's go make it. It's very simple. We're just going to duplicate another function. So go to our character animator manager, and this function is going to be used a lot for, I'll say, more intense animations. Duplicate your play target action animation entirely, and then just put in front of it, instead of play target action animation, we're going to say play target action animation instantly. And again, we're going to go and duplicate the server RPC, and instead of crossfade, we're going to use play. So no crossfading at all. It's going to be instantaneous. And then down here, we're going to notify the server of instant action animation server RPC. This doesn't exist yet. Let's go make it. And that announcement I mentioned earlier in the video, we're going to talk about that in a moment because it regards server RPCs and client RPCs and netcode as a whole. So let's paste all of these, the server RPC, client RPC, and function here. And all we're going to do is add the keyword instant in front of all of these where it needs to be. So notify the server of instant action animation server RPC, play instant action animation for all clients, and then we're going to perform instant action animation from server and erase the crossfade and just use play instead, and that's it. So let's erase the 0.2 here, and then let's save that. Now if I jump back into the project here and I hit this guy, I'll full screen it so you can see it better. Boom. Oh, he's already dead. Okay, I'll try it again. So if I go back into the project here again now and hit this guy, boom, there you go. It looks so much better. You can see there's an instant response there. And it looks way, way, way cooler and more intense. Boom, there it is again, a very instant response. It feels very impactful, very weighted, a lot better. So if I go to the network manager too, you can see he is repostable if I pause the game. So this is where you would perform a repost. Now, on to my announcement. So netcode has gotten an update recently, and now server RPCs and client RPCs work a little differently. Here's the documentation. I will link it in the description. It's not that hard to understand, and if you have a bit of practice with server RPCs and client RPCs, it's pretty easy to translate them if you're using a newer version of netcode. But my question is, I'm asking this now to you guys because I'm going to be honest, obviously anybody who's watching this video, you're so far into the series that this series is for you because you're the ones who are still continuing to watch it. So, since this is your series, I want you guys to decide how we treat things like this because I'm indifferent to it. A gentleman asked in the Discord if we were going to update to a new version of netcode. Now, I've taken a look at the updates, and to my knowledge, and someone in the comments could correct me if you think I'm wrong, there's no real benefit to updating netcode for this project right now. What I'm trying to say is we can do everything we need to do with the version of netcode we're currently on. And I'm going to hazard a guess and say that most of you right now who are watching this video are very likely using the same version of netcode we started the series with. And maybe some of you who are a little bit newer to the series and blaze through all the videos are using the newer version, but I don't think it released all that long ago. So, do you want me to update the netcode for this series and use the newer version and then do a video where I kind of translate what we have to the newer version if necessary? Or do you want me to keep moving forward with this version of netcode that we have in the project as it is? The only thing that you would need to change, to my knowledge, again, as I was informed by someone in the Patreon chat, is how we handle server RPCs and client RPCs. But if you guys, the majority of you, want me to update the netcode and then transfer and update any legacy functions that we have, I can certainly do that. But if you prefer we'd use the version of netcode we're on now and continue on with the series, I can also do that. So make yourself known in the comments below. I will go with what the majority says in the comments below. As always, guys, thank you very much for joining me again this weekend. I hope you all have a lovely weekend. I've actually recorded this video a couple days early because I am leaving town. So by the time you see this, I will be out of town. So any DMs or messages sent my way, I'll get back to it as soon as I can. As always, an immense thank you to my patrons. It is because of each and every one of you I get to keep doing this, and I love doing this, so you have my sincerest gratitude. And once again, I hope you all have a lovely weekend. I will see you in the next episode.